everyone. First of all, let me just say what I'm planning to talk about. There are essentially three things. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of a history of the Math Circles of Chicago so you can understand our context. Most of what I'm going to talk about are these ideas we've implemented to promote equitable access in a greater scale. And then there are a number of questions that continue to arise. And I think for those of us that are concerned about getting diverse groups of kids into our math circles, this work takes time, right? It takes a long-term commitment, building relationships with communities we haven't before. So there are a lot of questions that arise that we're thinking about. And as Mark said, I think part of the purpose of these shorter talks is to get together with a group of people that hopefully the conversation will continue for the next couple of days. So I'm looking forward to that. So to introduce Math Circles, I'm actually going to start by introducing myself. And I'm not doing it just to talk about myself, but because I think it's significant in some other things I'm going to say. So when I finished graduate school at the University of Chicago, I became a Chicago public school teacher, and I was a Chicago public school teacher for 17 years. I helped start a school called Walter Payton, which is where Math Circles started. So I was the founding teacher there in 2000, and it's a math science school in Chicago. And I did the things that I think kind of activities a lot of us have been involved with. So I was a math team coach. I was the director of the City of Chicago Math League, which had about 40 schools participating in it. I belong to a lot of professional organizations for math teachers, like the Metropolitan Math Club or ICTM and NCTM, the major professional groups for teachers. But in 2009, I had a special opportunity to start a graduate program at the University of Chicago. It's called the Urban Teacher Education Program, and I directed the secondary math and science component. And the purpose of UChicago UTEP, again, this is at the University of Chicago, not in Texas, was to develop teachers and teacher leaders to teach in Chicago public schools. So all the graduates of my program are now teaching. At this point, about 80 to 90% of them are. So it was a program meant to retain teachers and teach in the public schools in the city. And now, as Mark said, I'm at DePaul University, and my work is out of the STEM Center, and we work with at least one math teacher, typically 2 or 3, in over 500 schools, all the schools in Chicago, and the professional development that is organized for those teachers comes out of DePaul and the Erickson Institute. We do the 6 through 12 work. So the point of introducing myself is just to say that part of what has been significant in, I think, the development of the Math Circles and our thinking about equity is the people we have involved from different communities. And so there is the math contest community, and there's the math teacher ed community, and there are parents with engineering backgrounds, and there are a lot of communities. I think a big part of what I had to say is that it's bringing those people together that is helping us to provide more access for more kids, which is an ongoing process. So, as I said, this school opened up in 2000. I was the first math teacher there. And it was the original site of Math Circles of Chicago in 2010. At that time, it was just called the Payton Citywide Math Circle. The University of Chicago had the Young Scholars Program. They had some of you here even attended it. It also had an academic year program. It was closing, and so last year, we took it over. And so we now run the YSP Math Circles of Chicago site. So those are, say, our original sites, along with one other high school. But we've expanded in the last couple of years. And so our 2 newest sites, this is Bridgeport. It's on the south side. It's near where the White Sox play. This is in Pilsen. There's a community organization named Mujeres Latinas en Acción, and we partner with them to hold a math circle in their youth center. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. So we've gone from 2010, maybe starting with 50 to 100 kids. We're at about 500 kids at 5 sites now. We serve kids in 5th through 12th grade. Okay, our teachers. So most of the people that are teaching Math Circles in the Math Circles of Chicago, we do pay them. I'm the sole employee, and it's a 50% job. I'm the executive director. So we don't have any other employees, but we pay our teachers, and most of them are coming from UIC. UIC being the biggest university. It's a state university with a real commitment to the city. So UIC, UChicago, and DePaul. Okay, in addition to that, Chicago public school teachers teach a lot of Math Circle sessions. And I also want to mention that in addition to doing this work, we also run a youth math symposium. Last year we had about 130 kids give entries. And this year we're happy to say that Eugenia Chang, who's now the mathematician in residence, and you may have heard of her book, How to Bake Pie or How to Bake a Pie. She's going to be our speaker, and she actually taught a math circle just 2 weeks ago in Pilsen. So again, I think out of this community and meeting different people, we get connected to people like Eugenia Chang, and then we want to get them teaching in our circles. So that's a very quick overview of what we are. And I should also mention that I have a handout so that everything I'm saying is all in notes, but I want you to pay attention to me and not read at the same time, so I'm going to hand it out at the end. Okay, so that's what we do. There we are. And so these are the questions that I want to guide my following comments by. First of all, how do we recruit children in traditionally hard-to-reach communities? Okay, so when we started out at Payton, and I've only been the executive director for a year, so when this program started out at Payton, it was very much a program that I think may be typical of some math circles, which is that I don't know that kids are particularly recruited as they're sort of like they're somehow connected to people who are involved. Okay, so how do we do this? Secondly, what are we doing to make our programming welcoming and joyful? So in other words, we can recruit kids, but if we're not really welcoming them, if we're not creating a space that feels comfortable to them, and they don't stay, right? So if you think about, Mark, you're talking about like how do we assess our progress, how we're doing. I think part of this is to the extent to which we can measure whether kids are returning would be one thing. We have a lot of different ways to measure, and I can talk about that in the questions that I take. But again, can we think about actually making our programming accessible to more kids? And then finally, why scale? I'm going to come back to this at the end, but I think it's sort of inherent in this idea of how do we make math circles more equitable. But I'll return to this later. So first of all, how do we recruit kids? So I want to start with our mission. So there's this idea of start with why. I don't actually really recommend this book. I was reading it on the plane. But I think this main idea of having a main idea and purpose to guide what you do. And so this is our mission statement. The Math Circles of Chicago seek to provide 5th to 12th graders in all communities of Chicago with opportunities to actively participate in doing novel mathematics in order to increase their mathematical power and to promote a lifelong love of mathematics. So this is what we do. So notice that it's novel mathematics. We're not doing school mathematics. That's part of our mission. We're trying to increase their love of math. I think we've already heard people talk about that sort of thing this morning. And we're trying to increase their mathematical power, which I think gets at the problem-solving piece as well. Probably the most important thing, though, to me is all communities. Like, are we reaching all communities of Chicago? And so as we make decisions about what we do, we have to remember the why of it, right? And to the extent that we're, say, maybe reaching some communities in Chicago, is that helping us reach more? Sort of the way schooling works in Chicago, and I think New York, the public school system here, in many ways does a much better job of providing access to kids than is the case in Chicago. But this is more the Chicago model where we get some kids whose parents might be able to give us money, and then we use that money to reach more kids in other places. Okay, so what do we do to reach more kids? One thing is our programming is free. Okay, so we don't charge anyone for any of the things that we do. Okay, and so that's something that we definitely market. Community partners. We're going to be opening, I think, 1 to 2 sites in the next year, and we're looking for community partners like Mujeres. So Mujeres, again, is a community organization that works with kids, and again, in the grade levels we're talking about 5th to 12th grade, and they have all kinds of different programming. But part of this is the community that we had coming in. Like, what we needed in community partners are people that could help us do this kind of recruiting that we weren't doing effectively. And in fact, this is an organization that supports moms and women in the Pilsen area, which is a Mexican-American community, where they've built relationships and they can help us, give us access to the children of those women. And they can do the recruiting part, 1. 2, they have a space in Pilsen. Some kids going to the University of Chicago, because that would be the closest site to our Pilsen site, it's another world. And so I think this has come up again in other sessions, but this idea of having math circles, bringing them to that location, rather than seeing whether kids will make it to us. And of course, travel is an expense. So there are lots of ways in which we set up barriers by having something at a university or at a school that is in a particular neighborhood that's not accessible to kids. So part of what we're trying to do is expand where we're having these things. Part of this is our message. So I'm here talking about equity, and I'm hoping that in that way I will meet other people that are interested in these issues. And so when I talk about what we're doing, we have 5 levels of programming. Previously, when I started, it was Archimedes, Brahmagupta, Cantor, Descartes, and Euler. It's really nice alphabetical order. The problem was they're all men. So Descartes is gone, and he was replaced by Kowalewski, and then Haynes was the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in mathematics in this country. Okay? So in our message, we're trying to message that we're different. I would say another thing that has come up, and I think is really worth us talking about, is we don't do competition. We are non-competitive. We're trying to reach a set of kids for which right? They may not have gotten into the competitive school. There's lots of ways in which their messages, these kids are genetically no different than any other children, and yet there are lots of messages that the school system and testing gives them that they can't do math. And we're trying to give a different message. And so part of what I want to say about this is that this is not only about recruiting kids, but it's also giving us access to a set of teachers that we weren't getting access to before. I've got 11 new teachers this year. The majority of them are people of color. And I think it really matters the message we give. This is not about, we are not about accelerating kids. We're not about the smartest kids. We are about developing a lifelong love of math, and that's our message. And we believe that everyone should have access to that. Okay, finally, the teamwork pieces, I just want to say again, part of my identity now. I work at DePaul University. We partner with the Department of Math and CPS. As partly out of that, I met Felicia Porter. Felicia is the middle school math specialist for CPS, and through her, we increased our enrollment in all 5 of our sites by about 100 people. It was finding Felicia and her connections to schools and the way they trusted her, the way they opened her emails when they didn't necessarily open my emails. And so I'm saying part of what we're doing is trying to build this community. I have lots of PhD students in math teaching math circles. Now I have someone from UIC from curriculum assessment who's getting a PhD who's going to teach. It's partly the message, it's partly this network of people. And so one of the things that I want to say about recruiting more people to teach in math circles and recruit more kids is, what are the identities that people are getting to lead math circles? How are we reaching them, right? And so if it's just that we're in sort of the math world, and I love the math world, and I have lots of friends who are math professors at different universities, and those are maybe the most important relationships in getting this going. But I'm saying that there are other people in teacher development, people in curriculum and instruction at universities, right? Parents who are in engineering firms or financial firms. I mean, again, it's partly about context. I'm in Chicago. There are a lot of firms like Citadel, like Ariel, that are resources for us that can reach. Ariel Capital is a really good example of an investment firm led by a black man who is going to give us access to people that we might not have had access to before. How am I doing? Okay. So now I want to talk about, so I've spoken a little bit about how this is sort of a summary of our message and our recruiting. So now I want to go on and talk about how do we make our math circles more joyful, and I'm not saying they're not joyful, but I want them to be more joyful, sort of better taught, more accessible. One of the things that I mentioned is, of course, most of our teachers are these wonderful PhD students in math. And many of them have very good habits when it comes to teaching, but they may have no experience working with 5th and 6th graders. And almost all our 5th and 6th grade sessions are led by these PhD students. So we were fortunate enough to get a Dulciani Mathematics Enrichment Grant this last year, and I've used this. Our DMEG program is about developing the pedagogy and the ability of our students to develop a classroom community to make math circles joyful. So I started with 3 full-day workshops this summer. I got about somewhere between 10 to 15 PhD students to come each time. There were 3 foci, and if you're in teacher ed and teacher evaluation, this will all seem very familiar. The most important thing to me was developing classroom community. We also talked about planning, and then we talked about instruction. So for the community piece, I'm going to give some examples of this, but a lot of this work was around identity. And what was interesting to me, I had every one of these PhD students write a mathematical autobiography. What was interesting about it is that many of them had stories about how they couldn't stand math when they were kids. And so like our mission of, they got a lifelong love of math. Like how did that happen, and having them uncover that and then thinking about what kind of experience they want to give kids was a big part of that. It was interesting also, I have to say that some of the PhD students, particularly I would say the women, were often discouraged in many different places in their mathematical careers. And so now thinking about, we run math circles. I mean, I don't want to make a universal claim about women, obviously, but I think a lot of times when we think about math and the way we try and build a lifelong love of math is through competition. And I think for a lot of young women, that's a turnoff, right? Because math really isn't about competition. I mean, fundamentally, the fact that we use math competition, but we know that mathematical research and love of mathematics is really not about competing, to me is a real tension. But the main point is that I at least want my doctoral students to think about that if I have a little contest in class, that might provide some access for some kids and not for others. And I'm not saying never do it. The point is, let's think about it and let's have a conversation about it. Planning, we talked a lot about, like, how do you know when a lesson is engaging? How do you make it engaging? Okay. How do you So we talked about engagement, we talked about just clarity. I mean, as you're going to see in a moment, all our plans across our 5 sites are shared. And so really getting the quality of our plans is a key part of the work we do. And then learning some instructional moves. Okay? So just a couple of examples of sort of the outcomes of these workshops. This is actually being taught in a few hours for our 7th and 8th graders, our Brahma Gupta group. This was a information gap activity. Has anybody ever heard of an information gap? Is that, okay, good. So an information gap activity, this is not all of it, and I will say that all our plans are accessible, and you just have to email me and I'll share them all with you. An information gap activity, imagine cutting this up into 4 cards. Kids are in a group, each one has a card, and the rules are I can read you my card, but I cannot show it to you. Now, and then we have some puzzle we're all figuring out together. In particular, this was a cryptography session that she was writing, and so this graduate student, who a couple months ago had never heard of an information gap, went and wrote this to launch her own class for kids to sort of uncover this sort of particular kind of cipher, say. But the point is, and if you haven't heard of her, there's a researcher at Stanford named Elizabeth Cohen. It's now often referred to as complex instruction. The idea is, one, that 4 kids sitting in a group, they all have some kind of status. But now I'm the person that owns this piece of information. And moreover, I might have to talk 3 times before you really remember what I said. That gets everybody's voice in the group. Okay? I'm trying to get everybody to speak. In some ways, it's a little bit of a status treatment because some kid might come in with less status, but the research about cooperative learning is if you don't talk in the first 2 minutes, you're not going to talk. Okay? So I'm just really pleased to say that this doctoral student took this idea of information gap, and again, I can share with you all the plans for all the workshops that I did. I'm happy to do that. But she wrote this herself. Another example, I saw one of my doctoral students use a gallery walk. So the idea is you're wrapping up a math circle session. Kids have gotten different approaches to problems. Different kids chart what they do, and then the gallery walk is kids walking around. It might just be a question mark, it might be a smiley face. Both the kids putting the posters up and the kids who are writing the comments have a lot of ownership about what they did. And so again, in terms of the identity piece, it can be really powerful. And so I saw one of my graduate students doing this, wrapping up a math circle session using a gallery walk, which really gets a lot more kids involved. So those are just a couple simple examples. Again, we've got 20 minutes, so I can't go too far into it. Last thing I'll say is, we're doing common planning, so I'm pleased to say, before I came a year ago, there was no institutional memory of what we had been doing in math circles. I know there are places like UCLA that post a lot of stuff. So this is for all 5 of our levels, all our plans. So if you'd like access to these, all you got to do, I've got my cards, I've got this handout, I put my emails in the handout as well. You can get this and you can check some of these out. They vary in quality, but partly these are like 5th and 6th graders. We're on a 2-year cycle. So we're going to get rid of some of these. Some of them we're going to improve. Some of them are pretty great already. And so if you'd like to say, hey, Doug, can you point out a couple of sessions you think are particularly good, I'm happy to do that. Okay? But going back to the community piece, this also means that it's not about one person writing a plan. It's about, I have a Brahma Gupta team that consists of a CPS teacher and 2 or 3 PhD students, and maybe a mathematician, and they're all sort of working on this project of making these better. And I think it's that conversation that's really powerful. So to sort of wrap up, how many of you play polo? Nobody, right? Okay, but for a lot of kids living in Chicago, doing math that would actually make them love math is a lot like polo. They have no access to it whatsoever. So we need to be bigger. Right? We've got to grow to reach more kids. Okay, so we kind of started, I think, the way a lot of math circles do, where it was about kids that we already considered gifted in math, and we were accelerating them so when they got to college, they kind of hit the ground running. And so I'm saying, this has got to change, and we've got to provide more access for more kids. So to promote equity, partly we need scale, because by having scale, we have all these resources in the city, we bring them together, and then we bring those resources to other communities that don't have it. Part of promoting equity to me is that it be non-competitive and that it be novel. Like we're doing interesting mathematics that generates that love, but also that we're thinking about different kids' identities and how they're impacted by some of the things we do, like competition. It's not to say, I think competition has its place. Again, I was the director of the City of Chicago Math League for 9 years. But we're making this thing not be competitive. We have this collaborative community when it comes to the people that we know, the way in which we plan, et cetera, et cetera. I think that promotes equity because we're really trying to raise the level of what we're doing and really thinking not just about, I think when we plan, we think about ourselves and what we'll be doing. And we've got to turn that planning into thinking about the children that are actually in front of us and make sure they're part of that planning. We're free. I think that's a big part of this, and that we're going after all kids in Chicago. And as some people have already said, because we're trying to change kids' identities. That's our goal. My guiding questions, and this is really my last slide, Mark. How can we make time for collaborative reflection? This is a big challenge. I have these groups of people. It's like herding cats. They're all over the city of Chicago. And so this is a real challenge. So people need to give us lots of money is the clear answer to that question. But next question. Okay, what's the proper relationship to have with community groups? What should we give them? What do we need from them? Like, I have to make sure. I am a white man, very privileged. When I go into these communities, I have to be listening for what communities need. And not just say, we're going to get, like, we had it in mind, one community group wanted us to do math tutoring, which is what we don't do. I can just say that, but in fact, that's what they need, and so I need to help partner with them. I do have access to a lot of PhD students who could tutor. Can anyone teach a math circle? Is, I think, a really interesting question for us. And do we believe it? Like, does it have to be this person, this wonderful expert in math? Or can we have more varied people come and do it? And would there be some advantages to that when those people might share the identities of the children that they're working with? How can we raise the resources we need to ensure our capacity keeps up with our growing demand? Like, so we've grown by almost 100% since I started over a year ago, but we need money. What is the potential for our impact on practice in school and university mathematics classrooms? On the last day of my workshops, every person, every PhD student said they strongly agree with the statements this would impact their teaching both in math circles and in their university teaching. And so I think there's maybe some potential here when we think about possible outcomes that could be used to raise funds. So thank you for listening. This is my email address. I have, again, if you want to help me hand those out, please take a handout, which is a summary of everything that I just said. If you're interested in these issues too, I would love to talk to you over the next couple of days, and thank you so much for coming. Questions?
Where does your funding come from again?
So we had an initial donor in 2010. We've lived off that to some degree. Now we've gotten a grant from the Chicago Community Trust. We've gotten a couple of smaller grants. But we are losing money every year. We have enough money sort of from that original very wealthy person to get going that we're about 2 years out if we got zero more money. One of the things we're thinking about doing is we are free, but whether we'll do some kind of nudge, I don't know if you've heard of that book, Nudge, like when you register, then it takes you to a screen and there's bullets, and one of them is donate a different amount of money, and one of the bullets is like, sorry, I can't afford to do this right now, but it's going to default to, like, say, give $100. Because if half of our students gave $100 every time they did a session, we wouldn't have any money problems. So we're trying to figure that out. But for the moment, we're just losing money on that original gift, largely.
Oh, I run a very small math circle, but after when I'm like chit-chatting with the parents, I'll just hand them a little slip of paper that says, you know, we accept donations and here's how to donate.
Yeah.
I won't even say anything, I'll just say here.
Right. So we definitely do all kinds of. I mean, you know, the parent giving is significant, but it's not enough, especially at the rate we're growing. I think it's going to be easier to, like, we're thinking about, there's another neighborhood on the south side called Back of the Yards where it's a likely place of our future expansion, and I think that it's a new program, we might be able to get a funder to give money for that. I think it's existing programming that's really hard once it's already there. Yeah.
I have two really different questions. One of them is with regard to managing money. Art of Problem Solving used to have a foundation that would handle money for you. They've backed away from that. And so now one thing that our group's been concerned about is, do we have to actually have a tax ID number if we are going to take donations? It's a hassle, we're not sure we want to get into. And the second issue is that the math circle that I co-advise is relatively small.
Right.
We've got maybe 50 kids, let's say, on our mailing list, maybe more. People go in and out, and usually 25 kids come for a math circle every week, and they are, by and large, the kids who are the low-hanging fruit. They are the kids who have engineering parents, are incredibly talented, are interested in competitions. And one of the concerns I have is that not all of the parents are interested in doing things that don't support their own kids directly. How do you branch out and broaden out there?
Well, I would just say that, but that's been part of my message. Like, I mean, and so now, this is my, the beginning of my second year doing this. And I would just say that, that's my message. I mean, I think a lot of parents in Chicago that are more affluent that might be participating, I think are very open to that message. Because if they weren't, they would move to the suburbs and you know, for the school, you know, so their kids could go to a good school. So I think it's all about context. But I think that should be part of it. Like, if you believe in this, and I also very much believe there's no genetic difference between these children and these children. And so, like, they're just not getting the opportunity, and that's what we're trying to do. So I think part of it is getting parents on board of the idea that this is a social justice mission, and you want to be part of it. So part of it is changing those parents' identities towards that view of themselves is I believe in social justice through mathematics, sort of the Bob Moses kind of idea. And so that, I mean, I'm not saying that will necessarily work in your context, but I think it's worth thinking about, like, how do we get more kids involved? The other thing I'm thinking about when you're saying this is, again, part of what's been really the power of working with Mujeres Latinas is that it's kids' faith in that organization that's getting them in the door. And actually, that's our site with the highest attendance rate. But part of it is, like, the people they know there who are running sex ed courses and other things that they're doing there, it's the same people, and there's a lot of trust. And so building on that trust, and then I think we'll have trust when we've been in the community for 3 or 4 years. Like right now, are we still going to be there? I think it's always the question that kids have, given all their school experiences. Hold on just a second.
One more question. Can you charge money for groups of students and parents who are interested, like you were talking about, to fund your programming in the underserved communities? Do math circles do that?
Well, they give money to this big pot, so in effect they do. Like, we do. I mean, we have some parents that give substantially. It's just that we have a pretty big budget. I mean, I'm part of the problem because I have a half-time position. I really actually am an employee. So, I mean, that's the thing. I think a year from now, if you come back to me, we can see how all my experiments work. So, all right, so I'm happy. I mean, I think it's time for everybody's break. I'm happy to take more questions, or if people want to come. I hope we can sit next to each other and talk about this as we get going. I know I didn't have another question, but everybody's stretched.
Well, I'm happy to speak in another question, but it was a comment.
But people, feel free to walk away.
One thing that
Can we just thank our
And if anybody wants my card, it also has my phone number on it. So,
just one observation I had is one of the libraries we go to is in the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in Kingston, but we don't get a lot of the kids walking up from their very own neighborhood. So one thing I'm trying to do this year is advertising in a Spanish language magazine. I'm blowing all my grant money this year to place a monthly ad in La Voz magazine, and it's an experiment. I'll see what happens.
Right. And I also just think, I mean, these things, they take time. I think I think that